Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Tom, Tim, it's a pleasure to have you both on the show. I'm going to have you guys briefly introduce yourselves just for everyone out there listening, and then we're going to cut into the main topic of the discussion today, which is going to be the Assassination Records Review Board. Tom, can you please introduce yourself, and then Tim will go into you.
Sure. Thank you, Robbie. Tom Samoluk. I was the deputy director of the Assassination Records Review Board in the mid 90s.
My name is Tim Smith. I just recently, about a year ago, had a book published on the witnesses that gave public testimony before the House Committee on Assassinations. I've been a college professor, and I still do it part-time, teaching, oh gracious, everything from philosophy to logic to biblical Hebrew. So we'll have a spirited discussion today.
So the Assassination Records Review Board, even though it wasn't an investigation, it probably uncovered more for researchers than just by gathering documentation than any of the HSCA or really the Warren Commission chose to do. Warren Commission has more volumes, but whether we can say that was important, that's up for debate. But Tom, when you got addressed to be involved in the whole Assassination Records Review Board, I would like to get your just how you got started into it and what your overall mission for the Assassination Records Review Board was.
Yeah, well, on the personal front, growing up in Boston and later outside Boston, the presence of the Kennedy family was just part of virtually everyday life, as demonstrated. My oldest sister still has two scrapbooks that she kept for when JFK was elected to the Senate. So that was a presence in all of our lives, six kids growing up in my family. And I've watched some of the recent episodes, and including one that Tim was on, and talking about the memories that people have. And I was 6 years old, first grade at the time, and I have a vivid recollection. But I think that there aren't many that follow me that have actual recollections of the day of November 22nd, 1963. So from that point, I always had, even as a kid, an interest in what had really happened. And I remember that my oldest sister that I referenced, she got all the memorial books after the assassination, 4 Days in Dallas, and or maybe it was just called 4 Days. And there were a lot of photographs, of course, not the Zapruder film, but there were photos from Dealey Plaza, from various other sources. And I remember as a kid looking at those books, poring over those books and trying to figure out what happened. And I maintained that interest. And then, if you recall, in 1975, as has been talked about on previous episodes, Geraldo Rivera aired the Zapruder film. But prior to that, there was a conference on assassinations at Boston University, probably maybe February of 1975. And my younger brother and I drove. We were then living outside Boston. We drove in, we attended the conference, and we saw the Zapruder film shown there. And I vividly remember looking at my brother, and he was ashen white. And I had to take him out of the amphitheater at BU where the session was taking place. It was that shocking to see. And then, of course, it was aired on the Geraldo Rivera show a month later or so. So my interest continued to grow. I even before that, I remember the movie, when the movie Executive Action came out in 1973, and I started saving clips. And then it was the conference we went to, and then it was the church committee, and then it was the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And I was in college at the time of the House Select Committee, and I actually tried to become a college intern for the committee. They were not, my understanding, or at least we were told, they were not taking interns that would be there for only a few months because of background clearances that would have been necessary and would have taken time. Then the semester would have been over. So that just continued time and time again. And then in the early 90s, when the Oliver Stone movie JFK came out, and I was at the Massachusetts Attorney General's office Judge Tunheim was the deputy attorney general in Minnesota. And we had connections with each other through our respective offices. And through that connection, I ended up going to Washington for the Assassination Records Review Board. And if I could have afforded it, I would have done it for free as a student of history and as a student of the assassination, and believing in the cause that this was important to once and for all declassify those records. So for interested members of the American public, if they wanted to see them, they could.
So wait, Tunheim got you interested or involved in the Assassination Records Review Board?
Yes, because he was at the Minnesota AG's office while the board was in business. He actually got nominated and confirmed as a federal judge. So that was a transition he made during the time that the board was in business. But he was my connection to the review board.
Now, did he ask any of your opinions on the assassination and get the background about some of the interest that you had a little bit briefly into the assassination?
I never recall being asked that question, just what my interest was, which I freely articulated in probably much the same fashion as I just chronicled for you.
Now, what was the overall purpose of the Assassination Records Review Board? You kind of lightly touched it, but when it came to releasing files or just finding documentation that could be released, I mean, overall, you guys had set principles of how you would declassify, how you would determine, and then also the varying claims of where you can find material, what needs to go into the archives as well, too.
Right. Well, the law that created the Assassination Records Review Board, as well as the JFK Assassination Records Collection, is really an extraordinary piece of legislation. And basically, at a very high level, the mandate was, as you said at the beginning, Robbie, when we were chatting, not to reinvestigate the assassination, but rather to make the records available to the American public. Now, that's the one sentence capturing of what the board was. But the extraordinary authority was to deal with federal agencies, and really with their only recourse being to appeal to the President of the United States, which did happen in the early going on a collection of FBI records. But that was their only recourse. So the federal government, those agencies, were all of a sudden dealing with a new animal, the Assassination Records Review Board, that had authority. And that was very interesting in the early going, dealing with the FBI, the CIA, the whole alphabet soup of all the agencies. But the other thing that I'd like to mention, which you and Tim very well know, and that is that the board had authority to seek out records that were in private hands, not just the federal government, not just the federal agencies, private hands, municipal governments or state governments. And obviously that was relevant because you had the importance of New Orleans and the district attorneys there. So we had some, I'll call it, interesting interactions with District Attorney Harry Connick, and then also, of course, Dallas itself. So it was a broad range of authority as that law was written. And in many respects, I think that some of us who were involved with the review board have thought there have been subsequent incidents where the best way to get at an issue, a controversy, is maybe there's a model that we shouldn't forget, and that is the legislation that created the review board and the JFK collection.
Tom, can I ask a question?
Sure thing.
Oh, thank you. Did you run into any, trying to see how I want to word this. I don't want to name names, but did you contact people who you thought may have records of some sort that should not have had them? In other words, they had them illegally. Yes,
we certainly did leverage that authority. And then there were other examples where there was a possibility, not necessarily clearly articulated, but if the claim made by an individual was truthful, it probably meant that they had records that did not necessarily belong to them. I did want to mention one other point, which I know has come up on prior podcasts, Robbie, and that is the communication with members of the research community. And a name that I heard the other day, someone who was tremendously helpful to us and I really enjoyed working with, was Richard Trask. He gave us some direction on the photographic evidence, which helped us tremendously. And I'll give you one example right off the bat. He said, Dave Powers, the aide to President Kennedy, was in the Secret Service vehicle behind the presidential limousine and had an 8mm camera, as he usually did when the president traveled. He said, I think you ought to pursue that. And we did. And I had contact with Dave Powers. He's been deceased for many years, but he led us to where the film was.
Was that one of the only films you guys were able to pursue? Because obviously, did you contact any media corporations or anything like that? Like NBC has footage, and I've come across way too much documentation that says that they have these films and photos archived somewhere, but I haven't been able to find it online.
Yeah, I don't know if they're accessible. Yes, there is definitely, between the two that come to mind are NBC and CBS, because of specials that CBS did and interviews that they did. So whether that has been made available, I mean, we shut out the lights when we handed, not me specifically, but on September 30th, 1998. That's when the review board's tenure came to an end, and it culminated with the final report being handed to President Clinton in the Oval Office. So we're talking 26 years ago. What has happened with those archival materials that NBC and CBS had, I don't know, but I certainly think there's value in there because they interviewed people.
The book by Richard Trask, Pictures of the Pain, is, to me, it's one of those must-have books if you're going to look at the assassination.
And you know, Tim, I remember buying it actually in Dallas. I think I bought it at the 6th Floor Museum when we were there on a visit, and I had bought it. Jeremy Gunn was very interested, and he said, "Oh, can I take it tonight and read it?" And I said, "Well, all right, I'll let you have it because you'll get your own eventually." Because we felt the same way. Tremendous work by Richard Trask.
Tim, I want to ask you, but what do you feel was beneficial that you learned from the Assassination Records Review Board?
To me, the medical evidence just jumped off the page. I could not wait to get the transcripts of the interviews with Jeremy Gunn and the doctors, specifically. And the first one I got that I read, of course, was Hume's, which led me to eventually the chapter on Hume's in my book really is based on an early article I wrote where I compared his testimony before the Warren Commission, the HSCA, and the ARRB. And what I discovered was in 1964, before the Warren Commission, Hume said that the wound in the back of John Kennedy's head was slightly to the right of midline and 2.5 centimeters above the external occipital protuberance. In 1978, behind closed doors, Hume's, when the HSCA medical panel said, "Oh, no, you missed it. It's 4 inches higher in the colic area," which we've talked about ad infinitum. And Hume's really resisted to that. But when he came out and testified before the HSCA publicly, I think it was Gary Cornwell who was asking him the questions. When Cornwell said, "Our committee disagrees with you. We think you missed the wound by about 10 centimeters, or approximately 4 inches." Hughes's exact quote, if I remember right, was, "I would have trouble with that." But he did kind of capitulate to it. So now we have in 64, based on what I've said, Hume says the wound is one place. In 78, he kind of changes his mind and raises it 4 inches with some resistance. So I'm thinking, where the heck was the wound? I mean, you were with the body till about 4 or 5 in the morning. You helped Tom Robinson, the mortician, put it back together. I would think if anybody knew where that wound was, it would be you. It would be clear as ice. But then before the review board, when Jeremy Gunn asked him, I remember as if it was yesterday, I was reading it. And when Gunn says, "Where was the wound, Dr. Humes? Because in 64, you said this, 78, you said this." He goes, "I don't know." I'm going, "You don't know?" he eventually wrote a letter back to the review board and said, I'm going to go with my 64 statement. I'm going to deflect back to that. So in that sense, it was eye-opening. And not because I'm trying to catch someone in a lie. It's just I'm reading the documents and just trying to figure this stuff out. The stuff with Sandra Spencer was, she's the one who processed the photographs at Anacostia Photographic Place. Yeah, it was just the medical evidence. I thought that the ARRB did an excellent job. And Gunn was very patient when you read, at least when you read the transcript. Some of this is on audio, I think, on the Mary Farrell Foundation. But even if you're just reading those transcripts, you get the impression that Gunn is very kind to these witnesses, very patient. If they asked him to clarify, he was more than happy to do so, which, by the way, that never happened to the Warren Commission. And the first 15 volumes of the Warren Commission, which is nothing but testimony, there's never a clarification. In other words, it's too clean. So when you read Gunn's, it was refreshing for him to say, okay, I'm not sure you understand me. Let me restate it. I thought he handled the witnesses very, very well.
We talk about them just being involved to find records and what can be released, but obviously they conducted interviews too. But based on, I mean, it's going to be different for each researcher that looks at the ARRB, but from your experience working with them, who do you think was more involved or more obsessed with the whole mission of the ARRB compared to who seemed to be involved but was trying and maybe did a few things? I'm not saying they weren't, caring about it, but obviously Gunn, his questioning was what everyone would have wanted out of anybody that was in charge of the HSCA or the Warren Commission to do a thorough. Tell me again, you're sure this is what you're saying? This is how I'm reading it. You want to recall that? That was amazing work. But I'm curious, I know you're the communications guy. There are interviews and stuff that media wanted to get from Assassination Records Review members, but the ARRB conducting their own with personnel and trying to figure out certain areas, not just hearing claims about documentation. I mean, who that you worked with that really took an interest in what the ARRB's mission was?
Well, if I could, Robbie, go back to Tim's focus on the medical evidence. That was not a given that we could or should be doing that. Remember, we were supposed to be declassifying records. So you had to kind of, after a lot of debate and discussion and different views, you had to kind of arrive at a way that you were doing it that was under the umbrella of the law that created the review board. And not everyone would agree that interviewing the doctors and others that long after, decades after the events, was worthwhile. I know that obviously Tim saw great value in them. The decision was made to do those interviews. And of course, there are always people who would say they should have done more, but the clock was ticking. I'm sorry, that's just the reality. We got extensions on the life of the review board. And I remember going up to Capitol Hill more than once to see if we could get the funding and the extension, and we did. What was supposed to originally be a couple of years turned out to be 4 years until 1998. So gutsy call by the review board to have those interviews done, understanding that there would be some failures of memory, but that hopefully the record would be enriched by doing those interviews, and perhaps the prior record would be clarified as a result. It's up to, like everything about the assassination and the work done by the review board, it's up to interested parties, the American public, to decide whether it was worthwhile or not. But at least the records, to the extent that they have all been made available, and we know they haven't because of recent decisions made by recent administrations, but to the extent that we released the vast majority of what we saw, as well as enriching the record through things like the medical doctor interviews and chasing records around the country that were in private hands. And I did that. I made a lot of trips, and I think previously we talked about me, upon learning that Richard Case Nagel had died. I hopped on a plane and left Washington and went out to LA. because we thought it was important for the sake of the record collection, because there had been a lot of statements made and books written about Nagel. Did he have records? We wanted to pursue that, regardless of what our personal views might have been. We wanted to try to make the record as complete as possible.
Did you ever find that locker or something that he was claiming for the longest time that he had?
No, I believe it was the purple locker, and worked with members of his family who I met with twice out on the West Coast, and never heard about, never found the locker, and in the subsequent 3 decades have not heard anything more about it turning up.
Did the family show hesitancy in speaking about this? Obviously, when it comes to the, I wouldn't say stigma of the JFK assassination, but if you obviously are looking into it and consider, an interest, people kind of look at you because there is a bit of a stigma attached to it. And I'm wondering about the families coming forward. I mean, a lot of witnesses didn't come out till later.
It's a really good question, Robbie, because of what I experienced with those family members. And maybe I'll mention one other instance where there was a tremendous reluctance initially. I was the one on scene. I was in Nagel's apartment with them. It was me and 2 members of his family, and they later. I was collaborative. I had a subpoena in my pocket, which the U.S. attorney for L.A. had provided with me upon my arrival in L.A. An assistant U.S. attorney met me and said there had obviously been communication advanced my trip. And I didn't want to have to use it, never did have to use it, but because they were cooperative. But they later told me, after they saw that it was just me and it wasn't an army of armed agents, they told me that they thought a group of FBI-like agents in dark suits and firearms were going to push them around, and they were not going to stand for it. That was not my approach. My approach was to be clear about what our mandate was, but be respectful and cooperative with them, and it worked out. And so that was the first trip, and then the second trip, it was similarly. We were all on the same page, and they were cooperative.
Did you have any families that you interacted with, or any pursued leads where people were just kind of hostile, where you had to use the subpoena to show them?
No, I did not. But the other instance that I was thinking about, where there was this similar fear or dislike of the federal government, and it was really kind of unfortunate that that view was out there, which I ran into the other time was, and I don't know if you remember this, this ended up the lead story after Memorial Day in 1996, when Dan Rather was the anchor. I know the film outtakes as the Cooper film. And Judge Tunheim and I had gone to Dallas and done a little media, did some other meetings. And one of the things that Judge Tunheim used to always say, which is interesting in light of this Carpenter film within the last few days, which has emerged, that you might have read about, taken on Stemmons Freeway, and that is going to be auctioned off soon, I think. Anyway, this film, there were outtakes from one of the local newsrooms that this, I don't know whether he was a producer or a technician. I forget his first name, but his last name was Cooper. He was literally taking scraps of film off the floor in the newsroom. They were airing things, but then there were things that were left on the floor, and he kept them and he saved them. And so when we fast forward almost 30 years later, I guess, when Judge Tunheim and I were in Dallas, and the Dallas Morning News ran a front page article with the interview of Judge Tunheim as the chair of the review board. And one of the things that Judge Tunheim had encouraged was that, there may be people in the Dallas area or beyond that had relatives relatives that had cameras and were in Dealey Plaza and may have film or photographs in a shoebox in a closet. Well, that resonated. So this family contacted the reporter from the Dallas News, who happened to be married to a producer for Dan Rather, interestingly. And I knew the reporter. He called me up and he said, we got a call. I got a call. And after the article, which he had written, he was the writer, he said, and we know of a film, they're outtakes from the day of the assassination. And he said, this is what we'd like to do. He said, we would like to get first dibs on a story about it. That is the Dallas Morning News. And by the way, my wife works for Dan Rather. So CBS wants first crack at it. And whether it was the right decision or the wrong decision, I wanted the film. And so I agreed to do that. And you could probably do a case study on what the right decision or what the wrong decision was. But if I thought if we don't give them the opportunity to run it first and we say, no, we want the film, they're in possession, we're going to end up in the courts and we're not going to get it out in the public domain. So I went to Dallas again, packed a small bag, flew into Dallas, rented a car, went to the home of this family, and they were so initially reluctant. And they had said that they had lived in fear for the 30 plus years that they had had this film canister, which had been kind of passed down through the generations of the family. They thought that somebody from the federal government at any time was gonna show up and seize the canister that had the film. At one time, they had kept it like buried under a house, under a deck. They were so fearful of the encroachment of the federal government. Anyway, that is another instance where there was, I mean, again, we didn't have a lot of resources at the review board. We did a lot with the resources we had. It was just me that showed up at that Dallas home, and that made them relax a little bit more. And I'm collaborative. I wanted the film, but I was respectful of them, and brought that film back to the archives. And Dan Rather did air it the Tuesday after Labor Day, 1996. That used to be on YouTube. I haven't found it lately. I probably have it on VHS tape somewhere here at the house. But yeah, there are other examples of people really living in fear of the government, which to me is very sad.
Tom, if you had not run out of time, are there things that you would have liked to have pursued that you weren't able to just because you ran out of time?
Yeah, there was always more that we could have done. And I think talking about members of the research community like Richard Trask that gave us leads, I'm sure we would have scrolled down the wish list for those that had given us ideas. It's interesting with this Carpenter film being revealed just within the last few days. It kind of shows you that 60 years after the assassination, 60 plus years, who knows what's out there. So could we have been in some manner, if we had stayed in business, aggressively pursued more films and more private records? It would have been just consistent with the mandate of the board to make the record more robust.
Were you shocked that a number of researchers were writing in to you guys about certain areas and certain leads on things? I think it's pretty shocking. I mean, what not was it? It ended in '98, right? The review board.
Yes.
It was only out there. When did they start? '95.
90. The legislation actually was signed by reluctantly because he didn't like the law, but he signed it. The law was signed by George H.W. Bush on October 26, 1992. But then, of course, he loses to President Clinton. Clinton comes into office, doesn't nominate members right away. So that takes a while. Then the confirmation process takes a while. I wasn't the first staff member to join the review board. There were two, maybe three ahead of me, but I joined in October of 1994. And then the last day was the end of the fiscal year in 1998, September 30th, 1998. The final report was presented to President Clinton.
So almost 30 years, maybe a little bit more, some change on top of when Kennedy was assassinated, and you had all these people that were able to write into you. I've looked on Mary Farrell's site about the number of letters that were sent to you and other people that it was directed to, but you mainly handled a lot of the communications aspect. I think that was your job on the ARRB mission.
Right. I was, my title initially, I was the communications director, and then I became, not from the beginning, but I did become the deputy director and maintained some of the same communication responsibilities. We took it really seriously, members of the research community, because the knowledge that they had, and did we do everything that people wanted? Probably not. And you have to understand, there was a wide range, I have to say, of on the credibility scale of what people were asking us to do. Some of it was you had to make some calls. Some of them were tough calls about what we were going to try to do and what we're not going to try to do. Or when things emerged, we kind of pivoted. And one of the things that happened was in 1995, as one of our public hearings, and we tried to do it regionally with some regional diversity. So we had a hearing in Dallas, we had one in Washington, D.C., one in Boston, and one in L.A. But the one in New Orleans was when Harry Connick testified, the SDA, and said that the Garrison people had pilfered the files. They took a lot of the Clay Shaw prosecution files. And you may know part of this story. There was an investigator who had retired, had worked for both Garrison and Harry Connick. He was the hearing was televised live in New Orleans, and this investigator was at home watching it, and in horror heard Harry Connick say that. And the reality was that Harry Connick had told this investigator to burn the records from the Clay Shaw grand jury, and this individual thought that that was wrong. So instead of taking them to the city incinerator, he took them home and kept them for about 20 years, because this conversation with Connick was upon Connick coming into office in the mid-'70s after defeating Garrison, who was running for re-election as DA. And he kept them until he heard Connick tell what he thought was a blatant lie, because he knew at least some of the records were in his basement. And they ended up going to the review board, and Connick sued us, and we kept winning at the district level and then at the appeals level. And then Connick tried to have the Supreme Court hear it, and they declined. They didn't hear it, so we ended up with those records. And we had also gotten some records from Connick. We got more when the former investigator revealed what he had, and that enriched the record. So sometimes you have, as the fighter Mike Tyson says, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. Well, occasionally we would get punched in the face and would have to pivot. So then we were dealing with Connick and the Department of Justice attorney who was representing us in the litigation, because of course we were a federal agency, telling us, the staff and the board members, I suggest you not go to Louisiana until this is resolved with District Attorney Connick, because if he knows you're in the state, you might get arrested. So we stayed out of Louisiana for a little bit.
I'm going to direct this question at both you guys. Tim, feel free to always just toss out your own question. I'm happy to. But I wanted to ask Tim your experience when the ARRB was the JFK Act was passed and the ARRB was created. If you managed to watch it or you had an interest in it, then it was going to lead to my question for you, Tom, which is, did the public care when it was going on? How much did the trickle off effect happen with the whole ARRB once it got towards the end? If there was still an interest or people just gave up? I mean, obviously in the beginning, media was probably pretty perceptive to you guys and you guys were doing interviews. Did that continue till the end, or did it just become in the beginning and then next thing you know, fade off? And I would say with the ARRB, when you joined, and you mentioned 94.
The excitement. Oh, I'm sorry. The excitement, Robbie, was quite electric within the research community when the ARRB began to form and began to do work. There was just enormous amounts of excitement because I think the optimism was, wow, we're really going to get some good stuff here. And we did, no question about that. Some of the you can go online and get this. They interviewed different researchers and they suggested this, suggested that, which, as Tom says, was probably very helpful. But yeah, I remember going to a conference in Dallas in '98, and when you walked in, they had a copy of the final report for everybody who walked in the door. And so yeah, it was just very exciting. It was very exciting to read the report and everything that went with it. And then when the files were released, like I said, what I got initially was all the medical files. I was waiting, every day by the mailbox, waiting for them to arrive, because we learned so much. I think right now the temperature within the research community is, if you write a book and you don't use the documents of the ARRB, then you may not want to publish that book, because you're not going to get a full flowered view of the situation, because the work that the ARRB did was historic and it was relevant and it was germane and it was pertinent. It was everything under the sun. So I know when I wrote my book, I realized that if I just, as I've said to you before, Robbie, if I just analyze the witnesses of the HSCA, I have a dinosaur. It ends in 1978. And if I don't update that evidence, a lot of which I use documents from the ARRB, then I'm not sure my book was even worthy to write. So the ARRB absolutely helped me update the evidence, oddly enough, through the year 2022, still relevant. So yeah, it was absolutely necessary. And we're all glad that they did it, I can tell you that.
And the media perception for you, Tom, when you joined in the beginning of the ARRB compared to where it ended?
Yeah, I have to say, I think that there was a little bit of a media hangover, if you will, in that there had been a lot of coverage of the Oliver Stone movie, JFK, which came out in '91. And then there was the legislative effort to create, because of the end of the movie showing two screens, one about records from the Warren Commission that were not yet public, and then the HSCA records. And then that led to the legislative effort to get those records released. And then ultimately, it was a couple of years before the review board members were nominated and then confirmed, and then there had to be funding. So it kind of I thought that the interest fell off after the furor over the JFK movie by Oliver Stone and the subsequent focus on the legislation. So there were times where we, depending on what we were releasing, we got some coverage. I probably would have anticipated going into it that there would have been more media coverage, but again, we're probably in a little bit of a lull, except when we released something that was considered really newsworthy. But the research community, tremendous excitement, interest all the way through that I was with the review board.
You mentioned going up there for funding to Capitol Hill. How many times did you have to do that? And when was, I guess, the difference between the first time and the last time? How hard was it to fight the case that you still had work that needed to be pursued?
Well, the first time we went up to ask for an extension, I was really nervous because I thought they're going to be hard line. That is, the staff of the relevant congressional committee. They weren't. They understood about the kind of the stutter step start because of the change in administrations and then slowness of getting members nominated and then confirmed. So my recollection is I went up twice and it never was as bad as I feared. If we were going again and tried to get more time, probably would have not gone over too big. But we did get really 2 additional years for the work.
Obviously, with the work of the Assassination Records Review Board and the media perception, what was the hardest media outlet to talk to? Or not necessarily a specific media outlet, but was it more towards the beginning or was it more towards the end? You wrote some questions for some people on the ARRB staff. Certain parts were good things to address, easy topics, more difficult questions. Not necessarily saying you wrote kind of escape or dance around stuff, but you were giving people that would be asked a tough question, because obviously you have people that are largely interested into the subject that are going to have specific questions that would only create conspiracies if someone decided to speculate. So I do appreciate that you kind of did a guideline for a lot of the members, like Tunheim, when he had to answer some questions, just in case if they weren't prepared. I mean, you don't know what anybody, you don't know what I'm going to ask you half the time. It's out, even I don't know, but there's obviously positions that would create more of a problem. That's pretty predominant throughout the case, where you can look at Earl Rose with him wanting to do the body at Parkland, him being the coroner designated Texas state law to do it. He even says it should have been done there so we could squash all conspiracy theories that arose later with the body being transferred. I mean, there's a lot of this areas where there's clouded information, not enough documentation, and people will start connecting the lines. And I'm pretty sure with the questions that you wrote out was just to make sure that nobody said anything that could be used, much like a lot of people in the community use, of certain clips and segments of other people stating something and then turn it into a whole thing about it.
The mainstream media, I think that the views by and large were known that that the Warren Commission got it right. And that was a reality. What we would try to espouse was that the mandate of the review board was to get the records made public, available to people who were interested. And as a result, we were agnostic on whether the Warren Commission got it right or whether there was a conspiracy. So I think we established some credibility, and there were various records that we did make available. And what I think of now, all these years later, were the military records on Northwood that really were quite startling and revealing. Not directly on point on what happened in Dealey Plaza, but certainly enriching the historical record around the assassination and around the Kennedy administration. So in some instances, there were people that had no particular interest in the assassination, but they were interested in records like that. And I think they started to see, okay, the picture does become more full of the administration when you add records like that, as well as something that is specifically related to the day in Dallas, like I made reference earlier to the Dave Powers film, which we were able to acquire. And by the way, I don't want to leave people hanging. Dave Powers was filming during the motorcade. I think that it's on YouTube. There, he did not want it widely distributed, but I think you could probably find the Powers film. And he told me when I visited with him that, which was known, that he did have a camera, did film at Love Field during the beginning of the administration, but he had run out of film before they made the turn into Dealey Plaza. And sure enough, if you look at the film, I believe the last frame, Clint Hill is on the rear bumper. And if you look ahead, you're kind of looking through the canyon of buildings into what is Dealey Plaza. but they're still on Main Street. And so it's kind of unfortunate that the film ends there. But I always thought, just not to digress from your question about the media, Robbie, but I always thought that people would be more interested in the Powers film because he's in the backup limousine and it shows the positioning of President Kennedy and Governor Connolly, what can only be a matter of minutes before the shooting starts. Others could probably calculate that are more familiar with the map of how close they might have actually been to taking the turn onto Houston. But anyway, the Powers film got media interest. That Cooper film, as I mentioned, got interest, and there were other records that we released along the trail that were definitely of interest to the research community, varying degrees of interest by the media.
I have a couple of questions. First question is, did you make notes at all of, because all these stories that you're telling are, to me, just absolutely riveting. This is like a spy novel. Every time I listen, I think that could be a movie. Has Tom written a book? So one, I guess, did you take notes, and have you ever considered publishing a book? And second question, real quick, is do you recall finding out anything that just really startled you and caused you to really pause in the process of everything?
Well, yeah, you threw a lot at me, Tim, there, but I think if I can remember all the components of your question, I think I have answers. First, I did write an article for Boston Magazine on the 40th anniversary. It was a 3,000 word article, which was kind of a catharsis for me. So it was 2003, 5 years after I left the review board. And I had a great editor who was actually the editor of Boston Magazine at that time, helped me write it, synthesize it. And he said to me after the magazine was out on the newsstand, he said, we've had 2, 3, 4 articles that have been published in Boston Magazine that have been turned into books in the last few years. Would you be interested? And I said, well, hell yeah, I'd be interested in going down that path. So I did talk to an agency, an agent, and you'll find this funny since I already told you about the fight we had with Harry Connick. He said, we are in the process of working with an author on a biography of Harry Connick Sr., and we need his cooperation. And he said, so given, which I write about in the article about the tiff we had with District Attorney Connick, he said, it's not a good time for us to go down the path with you. And then life took over, kids and job and everything else. I will say this. I mean, I have that article is kind of like I said, my catharsis and frames what I was going through. And you're right. There were times that I couldn't believe when I went to Dallas to pick up the Cooper film outtakes, and I'm by myself, and they were so paranoid about the federal government. I got a little paranoid. So I'm at a, not the best motel near the Dallas airport. And the timing was such, I couldn't fly out that night. I had to fly out the next morning. I slept with the film canister under my pillow. Honestly, I did. And the next morning when I didn't really sleep at all. And the next morning when I got up to shower before I headed out to the airport, I had the canister in the bathroom with me. I was so tired, been exposed to these doubts that American citizens had about their government, It really had an impact on me. But I will also say one last thing about the about writing a book, and I haven't given up the thought, but I will say this: we've talked about what the mandate of the board was, but I would be dishonest with you if I didn't have a closet hope that through our work we achieve some resolution, some closure, instead of it slipping into the annals of history, which it has. Today I don't think that we will ever find the unequivocal closure that we probably would all like to have. And so that kind of influences me. And so when I thought about expanding the article into a book, and I said, it ends the same way. We didn't solve the biggest puzzle of American history.
That's not
And
that's
and
not necessarily what your job was, though. You
no,
played
I
an
know,
essential.
but there, yeah, but there was. We all have hopes and dreams, and so there was a hope that we would be the ones through the work, and even though that wasn't our mandate. If I recall, Tim, the second part of your question, I'll try to what bothered me. And one night, uh, because I had an interest in this story that actually emanated from out of Chicago, that the day after the assassination, or maybe late on the day of the assassination, it was reported, I think it was the DEA had a source in the anti-Castro community in Cuba. And this source reported that an anti-Castro Cuban had made statements that after the assassination really rocked him. And you can find this, the key name in this chapter of the story is Homer Echeverria. Echeverria was a anti-Castro Cuban in Chicago, and so I had an interest in that chapter. The HSCA actually had focused on that too, and because what had happened was the Secret Service starts to pursue it, or intends to pursue an investigation after the assassination, and then the Warren Commission is created, and the FBI says to the Secret Service, no, we're the primary investigative body, not you. Secret Service turns the file over to the FBI, and they did nothing. There was years later, a witness for the FBI at a congressional hearing was asked about it, if I recall this correctly, and admitted they never pursued the lead. So fast forward to the ARRB being in business. One night, one of my colleagues comes to me, knowing of my interest in that chapter, says, "You're going to be interested in this document." And it was a document that we intended to release and ultimately did release. The document talked about this story about the Homer Echeverria and the information that had been supplied. Again, I think it was the DEA had a source, and the document had been previously released, but there was a name redacted, and the name that was redacted was of an FBI informant. And that FBI informant was Homer Echeverria's father. And so there's two ways that you can look at the situation. You look at it the way that I looked at it, which was that's why they didn't pursue it. And this is one of the threads that run through my consideration of everything, all the investigations, particularly the Warren Commission. I'll focus on the Warren Commission, that they didn't want to open any doors that led to a conclusion other than Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone gunman. So my theory was, well, there it is. The FBI informant was a relative of the key guy whose name is mentioned by the source, by the informant. Now, others have said to me, no, you're looking at it incorrectly. They didn't pursue it because they did have an informant and they knew that there was nothing there. So you can look at it however you want. I know that I found it very disappointing that that particular lead was not pursued.
I was going to ask you, are there, and I'm not going to ask you for details because that would be disrespectful. I won't do that. But are there things that to this day that you discovered that you cannot talk about publicly?
That's a really good question because I've stayed in touch with Judge Tunheim and I've talked to him and others about that. I at this point in time, I don't think so. I will say this: one thing that gives me pause is that in the mid '90s, when we were declassifying records, one thing that we would hear from the intelligence community agencies, primarily the CIA, that a reason we couldn't release a 30-year-old document that talked about intelligence gathering methods was because foreign hostile nations would be able to build on that point and be able to extrapolate from that what was going on 30 years later for intelligence gathering in the mid 90s. That one, I always had a lot of questions about that. And in most instances, we would find a way to release the record, but not necessarily the core piece of information, word or line or code that the CIA didn't want us to release. But I will say this, since there's been obviously controversy and even recently reignited because former President Trump said that if he was back in office, this is when he had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. standing next to him on stage recently. He said, "I'm going to release all the records." And of course, anybody that knows the story says you had that opportunity and you chose not to do it when you were president. That there any records, and I think this is important for people to understand. We saw all the records, not me specifically, but review board members, staff members saw the body of records and made decisions very carefully that some documents would not be released or until the death of an individual who named in it, because the CIA, for example, would come to us and say, you can't release that document because the individual name is still alive and he'll be killed. He retired out of the United States, and foreign intelligence agencies will read this and they will kill him. So we wouldn't release the name of the individual until his death. Here's the boss.
Mr. Tunheim, pleasure to have you on here, man.
Hi, good to be here. Sorry, I have a thunderstorm going behind me, so there's some thunder going on here, unfortunately.
I noticed when my room got dark, I was like, it must be cloudy out or something. But we were discussing for the past hour some of Tom's work with the Assassination Records Review Board. It's a pleasure to have you here. He mentioned something to me. I had to ask him about it, but how did you decide to reach out to him to get him involved in the Assassination Records Review Board?
Well, I knew Tom from our days working in the Attorney General's offices. He worked in Massachusetts. I worked in Minnesota, so I knew him from that. And I just figured he would be the best person possible to handle the public relations part of our job and actually do much more of the substance work that he ended up doing. So I reached out to him right away.
Mr. Tunheim, when it came to assigning members or just what the overall mission of the Assassination Records Review Board is, me and Tim just talked to Tom about this, but we give you guys great praise. A lot of the research community does for the work that you have done. You guys weren't in an investigation, but you probably uncovered more than any investigation, in our opinions, that ever was. The Warren Commission printed a lot of volumes, but nothing of substance. But when it comes to the actual release of documentation, the pursuit of documentation, Tom's experience going to other people's homes and getting the documentation, I mean, how much of an experience was it for you being in charge of all that?
Well, I thought it was the best idea for us to focus on getting as much material made public as quickly as we could. We didn't take sides on any issue. If someone suggested that particular records might be relevant to the assassination, we didn't impose our judgment on that. We went after him to try to find him. And I think that was the best approach because our duty overall was to release as much as we could to the public so the public could make up their own minds about what happened and to not focus so deeply into one theory or another as to kind of ignore the broad scheme of everything. So that's why we did it that way, and I think it worked.
Did it leave challenge for you when the Assassination Records Review Board ended and there was still files that needed to be released?
Well, the end, I think one suggestion I would have if there are future groups like this is to don't make it a hard ending like that. Um, we started losing staff, which was hard on us because we were trying to, wrap up a lot of the work and wrap up a lot of the work quickly. And there was still expectations that we had of agencies to get files released after we were done. We had promises from the agencies to do that. Most of them have complied with that. I don't think the CIA has. They've reverted to their, release nothing mode of operation, unfortunately, and that's why there's still some files that haven't been released, or some actually documents is what it is. But it was a hard ending, and we could have used, another 6 to 8 months to wrap up, and that would have been better for us.
When it comes to challenges, obviously, that you guys face, but you mentioned with documentation, the CIA withholding stuff now, if they are, but the Secret Service destruction of documents that you guys had to experience when you were requesting certain information. I don't necessarily think we talked about this on your first time, but I don't think it's a necessarily huge conspiracy. It's just not proper procedure, whether they're covering some mistakes that they made during the assassination, areas they should have covered that can have been criticized later. A lot of conspiracies get built out of the fact that film documentation hasn't been released or it was taken and we don't know where it went. And a lot of stuff that seems like we have giant gaps. And I think what the Assassination Records Review Board was able to do was close off some of these gaps that we needed closed so we don't have a lot of this speculation that went on.
Well, we certainly tried to do that. The Secret Service was a difficult agency for us to deal with. I think Tom probably feels the same way. I mean, they tried to protect information that had already been released, for goodness sakes. I mean, what there a lot of documents existed in files of multiple agencies, and the Secret Service worked very hard to try to protect information which we had to prove to them had already been released through the files of other agencies, such as the State Department or NSA or the FBI or some other part of the federal government, and also trying to destroy records as well. I think that was more to try to protect their reputation. They consider it the darkest day in the history of the Secret Service, and I understand that. It was horrible. A lot of people didn't do their jobs right that day, but that doesn't mean you try to destroy information about that. It's long ago. It's over. The Secret Service has been changed a lot since then, and but they were difficult. They were probably the most difficult. They fought us really hard on the release of threat sheets, threats that were made against President Kennedy during the last year of his life. They were fighting very hard against that. They, in fact, enlisted, Tipper Gore to try to help them because of the mental health aspects are that go along with people who threaten to kill the president. And then it was eventually released, but it took a long time because of their opposition. And I think the documents didn't really demonstrate anything unusual or different. But if someone threatened the president in the year before he was killed, that's relevant information for the public to see.
When it comes to the stuff that obviously you guys might had to wait on releasing or things that had to be redacted, whether it was mental issues or something that was involved with personal family, or something that was within someone who was alive. But did you uncover any new aspects when it came to things you couldn't release, like a national security issue? Obviously, that's been tossed around. The word national security tends to be an umbrella to cover a lot of things. But looking through some of the documentation, even with names that would still be alive, I mean, it's been so long now, we don't know. There are people coming out every day that said they were a witness that passed away, or an obituary comes out or something. I'm curious if you came across anything that you would add to maybe the list of things that had to stay redacted, that you uncovered, whether it was going to be a national security issue or something of that sort.
Well, I think that we did find a few things that we were convinced had to at least be temporarily redacted. People who we knew were living, and it was proven to us they were living, and they had done something that might put their life in danger. I understood there were a few people that fell into that category. If it was someone who was relatively famous in terms of the files, we would try to use the same pseudonyms so that researchers would know it was the same person, not someone different. But we've long passed all of those dates. The dates that we put on for release have passed. The National Archives has followed those. I don't think there's any reason to protect names at this point at all anymore. And some of the reasons, the national security reasons for protecting information, I think have long passed as well. I'll give you one example, and that is the protection of the relationship that both the CIA and the FBI had with the Mexican government back in the 1960s. It was, I think, proven to us that it would definitely impact the political party that was still leading the Mexican government at that time if it was released. And that party is no longer in existence. So obviously there's no reason to protect that information anymore. And we had protected that. I'm not sure if all of it's out yet. Some of it has come out, but that's a good example of something that perhaps in the 1990s was a legitimate concern, but surely is not today, which is why I think that there really is nothing left that should be protected.
What do you think could be left that would be maybe a possibility of why it would still be on the list? I know you say you don't think there should really be anything that should still be protected, but we're getting claims from, like, and this is a question for both you and Mr. Tunheim, Tom. But it comes to the aspect of, like, President Trump says that if you saw what I see, you wouldn't release it either. When you state a claim like that, it sparks up a lot of animosity and a lot of claims and speculation. People can really go down the rabbit hole. So, I mean, it might be something that's low key, not really anything but just private names, or maybe something that could be some type of intelligence thing that probably has no huge effect on a lot of people's lives. But I mean, have you ever speculated on what could possibly be still withheld?
Tom, you want to take that and I'll follow up?
Well, thanks, Judge. The only thing I would say is that in then Chairman Tunheim would say it then and say it now, is that if there was anything that went to the core of the assassination that the American public had a right to know, then it would have been released by the review board. In some fashion, it would have been released. So for former President Trump to make that comment, personally, I don't know what he's talking about, because there is no smoking gun in the files that the review board reviewed and left some redacted documents under the conditions that the judge just referenced. So I don't know what the reference is by former president when he says that.
I think I agree. I think he was just trying to drum up some public attention to the files that were there. I think what's happening right now is really the remaining issues that have not been addressed or focused on are basically CIA files, much of which has been discovered since we were doing our work, and discovered in some, misfiled area or something like that. They just don't want to release anything. They've reverted to their position when we started our work with them, which was nothing should be released, because they would be then authenticating information that even if everyone knew about it, they didn't want to authenticate it by having it appear on a document that was released. These are a lot of them are sources and methods. And we know virtually all of the sources and methods of the CIA from the 1960s. I mean, it's a subject of movies, of books, of just about everything that deals with the Cold War. So trying to protect that today is really not really necessary. And I think it's just the CIA trying to protect everything that they have their hands on.
And as a result, you have the speculation because there is a void. The void is not having those remaining records made public so people can speculate, and the speculation is often wrong, likely wrong. And the easiest thing to do is to release the records.
At any point, did any or members of the HSCA or Blakey or anybody contact either of you about your work that you're doing for the Assassination Records Review Board at any point during the ARRB's extended period?
We brought in I think nearly everyone who worked for the House Select Committee on the Assassinations to give us advice on what we should do. What should we be looking for? I think, Tom, we brought in nearly everybody from that staff that was available that we could find. Certainly, Mr. Blakey was part of the discussion, and I had a number of discussions with him as well. So we got as much advice as we possibly could from them, and they were very helpful to us, is my recollection.
I have a distinct recollection of the day that Bob Blakey came to our offices because there was some issue with him getting up to our offices with security, and he was angry about that. So I have a very vivid recollection of that. And as Jack said, name the staffer, and there was communication from the HSCA, and there was communication with them. Interestingly, I do remember it's like me today, 26 years after the review board went out of business, trying to remember things that we were talking to them. So they went out of business, say the HSCA report was filed in 79, and we're talking to them 15, 16, 17 years later. They had gone on with their lives. It's like, Rob, you talking about records that I wrote when at the review board. You have a better knowledge of them than I do today.
Well, I'm face down in on half the records right now, so everything's fresh on the books for me. But
That's good to hear. We're the chairman and I appreciate that the work was not for naught.
Well, that's a big point I want to kind of reference here is that when it comes to talks about the assassination, we hear about the Warren Commission and we might hear about the HSCA. I've talked to someone who's turning 21. They could not tell me who Lee Harvey Oswald was. I asked them if they knew what the Zapruder film was, and they said, I don't really think so. And then I showed them it, and they go, oh, I've seen it. So that's good that there's still that little bit left in there. But when it comes to discussions about the Assassination Records Review Board, a lot of researchers like myself and like Tim, like many others, sing your praises very highly for the work that you guys were able to do. But at any point, like Mr. Tunheim, did you ever feel like you left something out there? Not saying that you didn't search everywhere, but saying if you had more time, if you had the 6 to 8 months, there's some other leads you could have pursued, but you had to leave it.
Yeah, there are areas. I mean, I think we had a start at getting at foreign records that were really significant and important. If we'd had more time and more of an ability to stretch things out over a period of time, we might have gotten the Oswald KGB file, which is in Minsk. We had very good discussions. We actually had an agreement at one point in time to purchase copies of that entire file, an agreement that was stopped by the government in Belarus. But we had good discussions in Moscow as well concerning files there. Some were starting to come to us. Vice President Gore was very helpful in that endeavor. And if we'd had a little bit more time, we might have gotten a lot more there, which I think was really important. And the other area is that we didn't really have the time to really hunt and search for more records on Jack Ruby, particularly his lawyer's files, which I would have liked to have seen. And that was an area that required a lot of in-depth work, a lot of research, and we just didn't have the time to wrap that up. We got some, but we didn't get as much as I would have liked.
Now, a little birdie told me, but were you in the Kremlin and Russia showed you some files by baiting you and they didn't let you look at it?
Well, we were at the Kremlin. The problem there was we did see where we saw a lot of files. Where I saw a lot of files was in Minsk at Belarus, where the originals of the KGB files on Oswald's time in the Soviet Union are kept, because that's where most of them were made. And they read a lot of them to me. We got some of them. We got maybe about 500 pages out of that file, which is an enormous file. If you can imagine someone under 24-hour surveillance by the Soviet government, they have a lot of KGB files on him. In the Kremlin, it was a little bit different. It was more like, if you'd ask a question about a particular document, you'd get the answer. Why do you think we might have a document like that? That kind of question back, it was a little bit of a game. And having said that, we did get some of the files that are there, but not a lot. We just didn't have the time to really build the relationships that you need to do in order to get those files.
Robbie? Judge Tunheim and or Tom, either one. I asked Bob Blakey once, back when he was teaching law here at Notre Dame, which is about a half-hour, 40-minute drive from where I'm at right now. He's obviously does not teach law there anymore, but when he did, I interviewed him there on a couple of occasions, and I do remember asking him once if he could look at the files of anybody, who would it be? And without hesitation, he said George Ioannidis. Was there any story behind that you folks ran into, or?
Well, we were clearly misled by the CIA about Ioannidis. I mean, the problem with Ioannidis was that he was also the liaison between the CIA and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He was a functionary, basically. That's what they knew him as, when really he had played a much more substantive role back in the Miami station with the Cubans. So, I mean, we had some of his file at one point in time. Our staff was convinced that it wasn't relevant, that he was just a public relations guy for the CIA. So they misled us. It's the one thing that Bob Blakey will get really angry about if you ask him about, because the House Select Committee was misled as well. Had we known more about his background, had we tied him together with the Miami station, there's no way those files would have gone back to the CIA. And the fact that they fought so hard to protect them over the years, years-long court battles that they've been working to protect his files, which is really problematic to me.
And if I could just add, Tim, on top of what Judge Tunheim said, the nature of the records released by the review board, the value is demonstrated by the fact that I think the credit, a lot of credit on pursuing the George Ioannidis lead goes to Jeff Morley. And Jeff kind of built on records that we had released to kind of piece together that there's something more about this individual than was known by the HSCA and by the review board. And he was right. And that sets the stage for this unnecessary, really ongoing effort by the CIA not to just release the records, which breeds questions and conspiracy theories. So again, what's the bottom line? Release the records.
Yeah, and again, the protecting themselves. The headline would be, of course, that the CIA misled the House Select Committee on Assassinations and later misled the Assassination Records Review Board on the true nature of Joanides. So that's a black mark against the CIA. So rather than releasing and saying, yes, we did that, they just will fight it and fight it and fight it.
Yeah, David Morales, his name comes up as well. Did you, either one of you, Judge Tunheim or Tom, run into any stalling when it came to David Morales?
Judge, I don't particularly remember that. I don't know if you do.
No, I don't. I recall the name coming up, but we didn't really have much in the way of discussions with them about Morales.
Now, I know you, Tom, handled communications, but when it came to dealing with the media, Mr. Tunheim, what was the biggest problem that you faced trying to do interviews or trying to speak about the subject matter? Obviously, you have to cover material and there's questions, much like for me, I'm tossing out questions that necessarily weren't tossed out ahead of time. But when it came to talking and being receptive to the media and trying to explain what the whole goal and mission, telling anybody that would be out there listening that if you have documentation, please step forward so we can try and gather this thing up. Tom explained earlier that there was obviously a lot of government doubts or people's doubts about their government throughout this thing. I think that comes with a lot of the stuff that ended up happening, whether it was deaths after the assassination stuff, whichever way it goes. But there's a lot of people that were just afraid to share what they had. So you putting out a message to the media, you trying to talk to the media and explain what your purpose, that the crew, everyone was just trying to understand and gather the information that should be available to the public and have it in a spot for the historical record, which I think a lot of researchers are on that basis now.
Yeah, I think that the media was mildly interested. I think part of it was, and Tom can speak to this as well, it was difficult to get the media's attention for a lot of the work that we were doing. And we were trying to do that. We're trying to be transparent and open and get the message out that if people had information, please turn it over to us. You can keep copies, you can keep the original, we'll take the copy, whatever. But we were trying to get the biggest possible record that we could on the assassination. And I think the media in the cities where we held public hearings was good. They broadcast that quite well in Dallas and New Orleans, Los Angeles, Boston. In Washington, there's so much news going on. This was the back page of the newspaper. So I felt that we had some cooperation, but not enough to really get the message out about what we were doing.
And when it came to one of the most important things that you felt like you were able to do for the Assassination Records Review Board, what would that be? Would that be the Lopez report?
Yeah, I think releasing the Lopez report in full was really important. This brings up a point that is related to a previous question you asked about what more would we have had time to do. I was convinced, probably not without a great deal of evidence in front of me, but convinced that in Mexico, there likely would still be audio recordings of Oswald when he visited the embassies, the Soviet and Cuban embassies. There's some place that I noted that part of the deal with Mexico was we could bug the embassies and listen to what people said in the Soviet and Cuban embassies, but we had to provide the Mexican government copies of everything. Now, as you know, no one has been able to find audio recordings of those meetings that Oswald had in those embassies, even though there's some evidence that the Warren Commission had a copy of that early in their investigation. We couldn't find it anywhere. All evidence that everything we were told was it was destroyed. They were destroyed. They were taped over again when the conversations were of no value anymore. But I really think that somewhere in Mexico, there are copies of those, and the CIA was working with me to try to find them. I don't think they really took much of a extra effort to get it. But again, we were at the end of our work, and within months, we were no longer running a federal agency, and I had no ability to work with them anymore to try to find these records. I think there's something there, but that there was another area that we ran out of time on.
And I would say, Robbie, I would say that what Judge Tunheim described, that it was a thread that ran through, I think, the existence of the review board, that the agencies, after the early FBI appeal, Jack, of those records where White House counsel said the president is not going to decide this, the review board and the FBI are going to settle this. After that, I kind of thought that the agencies took an attitude that we're gonna be here long after the review board is gone. And so I think the attitude was, if you can slow walk something, slow walk it, because they're going to have to be wrapping up at some point and we'll still be here. And for the CIA, that's consistent with their attitude of not releasing the Joanides records and fighting in court to the death on that.
Did you feel that in other areas of your investigations, or anything, principles where you felt roadblocks that you felt like they were just trying to wait you out?
Well, I think that at the beginning there was clearly that feeling that, well, this is a temporary group. They're a temporary irritant, and they're going to be gone soon, so we don't really have to cooperate. But I think they realized early on that we meant business, and I felt that for a long time we had a good relationship with the CIA. They were very interested in releasing materials through us that they did not feel that they could release directly, because it would be, an admission of something that they didn't want to admit to. But releasing it through us, it gave them a bit of an excuse. So I thought we had a good relationship for a while. But then I also felt that they were hiding stuff that we really needed to see. One good example was, I don't know if you remember this, Tom, but we were after this for a long time. It's a memorandum called the Family Jewels memorandum within the CIA. It was a document provided to the director, Schlesinger, when he wanted to know everything bad that the CIA had ever done before he was going to go testify before the Church Committee. And we finally got it near the end. There were some aspects that I thought were related to the assassination. It's all been released now. We were able to release part of it, but it took us at least 2 years to get that transferred over to us. So what other documents fall into that category? I don't know. There may be more, because we saw that document 2 weeks before the end of the review board.
Did he get that Family Jewels title from Blakey? That was Blakey, what he called his files.
It probably is the case. That's what they called it at the CIA, the Family Jewels.
It is a great name for it, I can tell you that. When it came to some of the interviews the ARRB did, we mentioned this with Tom, me and Tim did, but obviously when it came to the medical stuff, that it was able to be done by Jeremy Gunn. I mean, were you shocked, or did you feel any hesitation when it came to like more interview of like Sandra Spencer and others when it came to some of the autopsy stuff and material?
No, I thought that was a good use of our time to try to get at more detail that could be supportive of the files. I don't think it took away from any of our work to gather information, from other sources. So I thought that was good. I mean, I sat in the room when the medical experts looked at the photographs and the X-rays, the photographs which had recently been digitalized. They were just faded 1960s photographs of the autopsy and the X-rays, and it was fascinating to listen to their discussions and what they were looking at. I thought that was a very good step that we took to try to bring more clarity to old photographs and old documents and old reports. And so I was happy that we did that. The interviews, there were depositions of the autopsy positions, I think was helpful as well. So we tried in areas that we could to expand on the existing file without being investigators, but being in search of a full record, so to speak.
Were you aware that you could go that far? That you could ask those questions? You could do a style like that instead of just waiting or requesting for files or chasing down leads?
Well, it wasn't really clear, but I think the ultimate goal of the legislation was to create as complete a file as possible for the American public to be able to access and to decide for themselves. So we took that seriously, that, if we could add clarity to a certain area, we would do it. And no one pushed back on us. So we were able to pull that off.
Did you ever have to use subpoena powers on an organization?
I don't the Justice Department controlled whether we could issue a subpoena, and that was somewhat difficult. They have very strict standards on subpoenas, and I think we did use it a number of times. I don't recall specifics, but we certainly were. One time I tried to use a subpoena power was on NBC because they had documents that originally belonged to Walter Sheridan, who was one of Bobby Kennedy's investigators, and I wanted to get them. They were in the Kennedy Library when we took office, and Sheridan went and got them, picked them up, and took them back himself. And I don't know what's in there. We never saw them, and he eventually deposited it at NBC, who would not turn them over to us because Sheridan had served as a reporter for a time doing coverage in New Orleans during the trial there. And so I wanted to subpoena them, but unfortunately, the Justice Department said, well, we don't subpoena news organizations.
Yeah, Robbie, I think the strength, as Judge Tunheim remarked, the strength of the medical interviews that Jeremy Gunn did, he let the people talk. And when you compare that with, let's say, our inspector for the Warren Commission, you always felt like he's leading the witness and dangling something. But Jeremy never did that. He would clarify, he was patient, he was kind. And I think as a result, it probably made the people just feel comfortable and just let them talk. And I think the end result was a lot of fruit on that tree. We learned a lot from the medical witness as far as clarification.
Well, if he's sipping on a pina colada in Morocco or wherever he went, please come forward. That'd be awesome. I'd love to talk to you. But when it came to some of the obviously trips that you guys had to take or conferences that you've had to do, a lot of media or interest in the assassination each year for the anniversary. They want people to speak about this, either the ones you have been involved in or just been contacted by independent researchers through email. Does it keep up, I guess, the hope that what you guys did with the Assassination Records Review Board continues? Because like I said, I'm one of the researchers out here trying to fight to have you included in the historical record. My generation specifically needs to focus on you guys and at least recommend that either reaching out or just trying to get you guys on the record. I think we talked about with Tom is him writing a book. I'd love to see a book on your work of Tom's and yours, Judge Tunheim. It's just we need a record here, and right now all we're referencing is the Warren Commission, but what we've learned from 63 is completely different than what we know in 2024. Oswald wasn't the exact person they painted him to be. Whether you agree he was a lone assassin or not, it's not even about that. It's just that we know a little bit more about what he was involved in, whether it was the U2 program or whether there was other things. And I get that's intelligence stuff, but for me, historically teaching it, that is significant. And I think even with the HSCA's work, whether they said it was more of a mob thing, that's fine. But they still need to be talked about as well, too. Everything needs to be talked about. It can't just be focused in one area at one point in history.
Yeah, I think it is important. Obviously all of us have our copies of our own notes and files and everything from when we did the work, and I think it would be helpful. My problem is people keep suing each other. They're in front of me. Imagine that. And people keep committing crimes and getting charged. So I'm so busy still with my work. But I know I would be obviously very interested in anything Tom wrote because he was really essential to this effort. And maybe I'll get around to it one of these days.
Well, the question I had for the judge is if he wrote the book and then they made a movie of it, who would play him in the movie?
Oh, I got a
We'll
perfect
have to
one
think
for you
about that.
guys. You guys have seen JFK, I'm assuming, so you know Dean Andrews' casting was perfect, right? I got this one I saw. So here's Joe Anides, and then here's that one famous actor.
You got it. There
That's
you go.
perfect. I
Looks
saw that. I
good.
was like, bam. But obviously, when it comes to the work of the Assassination Records Review Board and all these discussions that go on 60 something years later, have you guys maintained the idea, or you guys still think that it was just Oswald alone? I mean, you guys haven't added any details or anything when it came to the official story. You guys looked at me when I said it earlier, so now I got to address it.
Well, I mean, my view is, I mean, I will always keep an open mind. I'm always interested in what researchers are doing, what they're finding, what their new conclusions are. It's very interesting to me. I can follow the trail of the work that they're doing, and I like that. I think that's really good. That really, the fact that people use the records that we were able to uncover is very gratifying because that was really our job. Having said that, I'm also a judge, so I deal with evidence that can be proven in court, and I think you could prove in court that Oswald killed him. With the part that is unknown and will probably forever be unknown is whether he had any Confederates urging him to do this or telling him to do this or having some kind of connection with him in advance. That's been a mystery forever. But I do not see evidence of another shooter that day, and Oswald was there with his gun. And so that's my conclusion for now, but I will keep an open mind forever because I think it's important to keep examining the record and trying to figure out if there is more to the story.
Robbie, I probably, because the judge is my former boss, not my current boss, I probably have a little bit more latitude here than I would have in previous decades. But my problem, I guess, is um, that the Warren Commission, as I referenced earlier, to me, they did not conduct an investigation that was appropriate in that they did not want to open any doors that could possibly lead elsewhere. So we're left where we are now, and the review board was left trying to reconstruct a record that was more robust. But I have a lingering sense. I am not a judge. I am an attorney. I am a former prosecutor. I'm not saying if I was in court what the result would be, but I have a lingering sense that there is more to the story than we were led to believe. But as the HSCA said in 1978, 15 years after the assassination, the trail is cold. And so the opportunities to try to bring unequivocal closure passed a long time ago. But I have a lingering doubt that we have the whole story. And there is the frustration. So what do you do about it? Well, I think you do what the review board did, was mandated under the law. Release the records. We released as many as we could, but now the rest of the records should be released. So if there are interested parties, they can look at as robust a record as possible to draw their own conclusions, whatever they may be, agreeing with me, disagreeing with me, agreeing with the judge, or disagreeing with the judge. Have it all out there and not this lingering doubt. Oh, the federal government is holding back. So that it's that thread of cynicism that I saw when I went to Dallas. Or one story that Judge Tunheim will remember. We got the Clay Shaw personal files. They came from through a reporter in New Orleans. They had been passed down from friend to friend over the decades after Clay Shaw had died. And because we established some credibility, had to overcome cynicism about being representatives from the federal government. But I flew into New Orleans and rented a car, drove to Waveland, Mississippi, and brought the records back. And now they're at the National Archives. Clay Shaw's diary, other documents that were in his collection. So that's about the most we can do and can continue to do, since the job is not done, is to put it all out there for people, for the American public to see, for those who care.
Do you think that it should have been this long without files, where we have a point where it's been past 60 years and there still hasn't been? Obviously, I think we're all of the opinion most researchers are free the files. I have not really come into the small minority population that says we should still be keeping things sealed. But obviously, squashing conspiracies, really trying to get a definitive result, and even if one, just a conclusion that the government's not holding with anything back. They did destroy some stuff that we don't know, but from what the things that they do still have, I do believe that they should be released. But obviously, when your board should have ended, is all the files should have been released at the end of that, in my opinion. So the fact that it has been this extended amount of time, even past the 60th anniversary, it's been a year and a half since we've all done our episodes. You guys have been separately on my show. So we're still kind of in the same predicament. They released a couple more or a little bit more, but not enough. There's still some files, whether they have answers in them or not. But the community, the people that are dying off every single day, deserve to have those answers.
Hey, Robbie, I know one thing that was a problem when I did my book on the witnesses who testified before the HSCA publicly was I wanted to talk to them, and guess what? They're dead. My students sometimes ask me, if this comes up in a class or I'm giving a talk at the local library, hey, where would I start? And that's a problem because so many people are gone. The idea of interviewing witnesses, that's a very, very cold trail. And I think, the idea, and I tell my students this, and when I give talks at the local library, I said, look, the stuff I'm talking about tonight, I'm not trying to make disciples to follow Tim Smith. I have no interest in that whatsoever. And because besides, this isn't about me. What I think we should do as best we can is look at the evidence. Where does the evidence lead? Not try to, get people to, because at the end of the day, let's say there was a conspiracy. I don't have much interest whether I'm right or wrong on my position on that, if there was one at all. I think it's much more important, and I think the temperature of our discussion today is let's just get the files out, let people read them, let them decide for themselves, respect that they're adults, and respect their ability to analyze evidence, which is not easy sometimes, as we all know. But I think if you go into this with a preconceived opinion, that's a death trap. That's going to lead you nowhere really fast. And and we have to be honest. I find myself, Robbie, most of the time going, I think, maybe, possibly, because I don't know with absolute certitude on a lot of this stuff. The evidence will take you so far, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in this Kierkegaardian mode where you take this massive leap of faith because the evidence just stops. And so ultimately, we have to be honest with what we know and what we don't know. And we have to be honest with our audience, which, I think we are here today. But yeah, it's a slow path, and the path is only going to get slower with time because so many people are gone.
Yeah, I think it's time to release everything. We're long past that time. The law really anticipated in 2017 that all remaining files that were protected should be released. I see no reason to protect anything. I find it interesting that the CIA is working so hard to protect documents that they prepared in the 1990s to try to convince us not to release information. That's part of the group of documents that are still yet to be released, are documents prepared to advocate to us, which I find kind of interesting. But I think everything should be released. We're long after the fact. This was, the in many respects the crime of the century in America, and people should have the right to see everything that's done. And if you protect one document, someone is going to say, well, you're hiding the real story. Just release it all, get it all out, and there's still going to be probably files that will be found, sitting under someone's bed someplace, or in a closet, or in an attic somewhere, or in some document, wrong document file within the CIA. But all the other agencies have taken the position we're not going to fight anymore. This stuff is going to be released. The CIA is the only one fighting at this point in time, as near as I can tell. And it's time to release it. There's no reason at all to continue to protect documents so long after such a seminal event.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that it's hard to believe, having passed the 60th anniversary, that I don't know if Judge Tunheim remembers, we co-authored an op-ed on the 50th anniversary. We were talking about George Joannides then, because Jefferson Morley was already on his litigation path. And so another decade has passed, but the position of the CIA hasn't evolved at all. You'd think, wait a minute, another 10, now 11 years has passed. Doesn't that matter? Doesn't the ball move? And they just protect those family jewels.
I know what happens in these meetings in the White House, because we had these kinds of meetings with the CIA ourselves. We'd have meetings where we'd have the chief censors, the general counsel, everyone sitting around the table trying to convince us that we couldn't possibly allow release of certain information. This is what happens, in the White House now when they come to that final decision about whether to release any more of this information. It's a one-sided debate. The CIA is there saying, "Oh, this would be the end of the agency. We wouldn't be able to collect information anymore if you release this." And presidents kind of give up. There's no one arguing the other side. And that's part of the problem here, with both Trump kicking the can down the road and Biden releasing more information, but also kicking the can down the road on some of the documents that still haven't been released. There is no pushback. There's no one at the table saying, "Wait a second, this is not necessary for this to be protected." And the National Archives, who I had hoped would play that role, plays it to a certain extent, but they're doing it without kind of the direct authority that we had. And so I think they're relatively ineffectual, even though they've tried very hard to provide a focus on openness.
I feel like I know the answer to this question before I even ask it, but it would be ashamed of me not to ask it. No, it's not. Did Oswald do it again? But I was going to ask about, there's a account from, I think there's Mary Spencer, and then there's an account from Mary Stevens. It's in the HSCA files. I have 2 clips of it on my YouTube channel, but their testimony stated about a green filing cabinet in the Dallas Police Department. They don't know what it was for, but the only person that had a key to it was Elton Coolin, and they don't know it. All they knew was JFK assassination related material. That material was then transferred from the DPD basement into the National Archives, and I haven't been able to find any link or anything of any transcribed of what that documentation is. Do you happen to know of any time during the Assassination Records Review Board that you guys came across material that was not released like that, but then was submitted into the archives?
I don't recall anything like that. Yeah. I know that they found Ruby trial files not too long ago that they thought had been destroyed many, many years ago, and they found them in the files of the DA's office there. I don't know what's happened to them, whether they've gone to the National Archives or to the 6th floor museum. The 6th floor museum has been collecting information too, and they were in some respects a rivalry with us. My point was, well, if they collect information and release it to the public, I'm fine with that. But I still think that it's best to have a single collection at the National Archives, so there's one place where people can go and access the information that they want.
You guys have given me enough of your time to talk about this subject. I really do appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. Seriously, thank you so much. That goes to you, Tim, as well too. But Mr. Tunheim and Tom, it's been a pleasure chatting with you guys about this and speaking about the Assassination Records Review Board. But one final question is, can you guys give a brief what the Assassination Records Review Board meant to you and what it did when it came to the historical context of the JFK assassination, just for my generation to understand the gravity of what you guys were able to really pursue and what you guys did do for the JFK community?
maybe I'll go first. So Judge Tunheim gets the last word here. Robbie, I'll end where I started. And first, it was an honor to have that role and to have a committed public servant like Judge Jack Tunheim, and obviously his service preceded being chair of the review board and continues to this day. So for me, as I said, I had been aware of the assassination and had a recollection from the day that it happened. So to be able to play a role in making the historical record of this terrible event as robust as possible for the American public was more than I ever thought that I would be able to be a part of. And I will just say that the review board members that served with Judge Tunheim and the staff took the law and the responsibility seriously. And I think that they share the same pride that our work remains available to the American public and always will be up at the archives facility at College Park. So what you've talked about, the use by researchers of the records, is really the testament to all that we did. So we appreciate that our work lives on in that respect.
Yeah, well said, Tom. I mean, I thought it was a remarkable experience. I mean, I was a history major in college, and this is a joy to work with history, even though history of something as sad and as tragic as the assassination of a president. But I do think that we worked very hard to open everything. One of the cardinal rules that we followed from day one was that anything that's directly related to the assassination, it doesn't matter who wants to protect it and for what reason, we're going to release it. So to the extent that there were words and phrases and paragraphs that were redacted, it doesn't relate directly to the assassination. It's part of the story. And I like to say that, we came upon this giant jigsaw puzzle that had a lot of pieces missing, many pieces missing. Some missing through mistakes made in the past, some missing through probably destruction at some point in time. We found as many of the missing pieces as we could to fill in the picture. It's still a jigsaw puzzle that has missing pieces, probably will be forever. But I thought it was a remarkable experience to have this kind of ability to release quickly information that is really critical for the public to understand, information that should have been released in the 1960s and likely would have been released today if this event had happened today. It was just an era that too much was protected, and the protection of information, the hiding of information dramatically impacted the public's reaction to their government. I think that was a shame, and we tried to correct as much of that as we could.
Tim, before I hit the end button.
Sure. I think that the work that the ARRB did is obviously an understatement for me to say it was, fantastic, or whatever word accolade you want to use, but especially in the medical evidence, I just think, and they did a lot of good stuff outside of that too, but it added a lot more pieces of the puzzle we now see because of the ARRB. Without them, we would not see a lot of what we see today. So absolutely to be commended, and thank both Judge Tunheim and Tom for being on the broadcast today.
Yep, thank you from my perspective too for being on my show, and thank you from the research community for the work that the Assassination Records Review Board did do. Thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.